Okay, the reason why we got to go through so much is because of the background, and because there are 980 years between voting periods. Okay, because Moses is talking about Moses' own voting period is occurring here, and the verses 16 and 17 are way down here, okay, between here in row 144 and row 149. And these last 49 years here that are ending at what we call 396 BC are the 49 years of Daniel. So I got a lot of explaining so that you understand why, this is so important. So, we're going through all of Israel's history first. Okay, so Moses votes. Israel comes out. That's the Exodus, Israel's birthday, 15 Nisan 1440 BC. One day Israel will figure out how to date that properly. It's 14 days after any vernal equinox at sundown. Okay? So, that is happening just about, 300 and some years before the 3,000 had to be, was going to close. And somebody had to get a 1,000 award by then, and it's Moses. All right? Because Abraham's personal 1,000 is going to run out 46 years later. So notice how Abraham's 1,000 is covering the time, but there has to be a new recipient, and Moses is it. But he says it should be Israel, so Israel gets it. Now Israel's the one who's got to vote, and Israel votes what? We don't want God as our king. We want a human king. And so the first guy who was supposed to carry the baton, therefore, as the king, would have been Saul. But Saul didn't turn out so well. And that's what Paul is explaining in Acts 13:20 and following. Because he's using the 490 accounting to explain that. The 40 bad years in the wilderness, the 400 years in slavery, those are bad years. Again, he's accounting in Psalm 90:15 terms. Psalm 90:15 again, give us as many good days as you gave us bad days. Okay, well, there were bad days of 400 years of slavery, and bad days of 40 years in the wilderness, and bad days of 40 years under Saul. And the only place you know that Saul ruled for 40 years is in Acts. In 1 Samuel 13, they didn't even preserve the number of years he ruled. He was such a bad king. He was such a bad king that he named his kids Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth. Now, Bosheth means shame in Hebrew, but the original name, and the reason why they changed it to shame, is it was Baal. The god Baal, which is another name for Chemosh, which is another name for Molech, which is the guy you give your kids to burn them. In other words, he was dedicating his kids to be burnt. In other words, he didn't care about God at all. He had gone so negative, he was worshiping Baal. And his kids were supposed to be dedicated to Baal. You got that? He had dedicated his own kids to be burnt. Fortunately, it didn't turn out that way. Alright? That's how bad Saul ended up being as a king. And he's saved, he's in heaven, he'll tell you all about it when you get there. God raises up instead David. David means beloved of God, means that David loved God. Again, it's that duality. David gets all the time grants. David is going to be the father of Messiah. That's the promise in 2 Samuel 7. Now, that promise in 2 Samuel 7, if you go look at the chapter in any translation you like, has two things in it. It starts, and the context is David is finally at rest. He's beaten the Philistines, blah, blah, blah. And he says to Nathan, who's actually his son, through Bathsheba, Nathan the prophet, I have this really great house, but where's the house for God? Because remember, Moses had started it with a tent very fancy tent, but still a tent. And it had gone to Shiloh and blah, 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 and you can read all that story in Samuel. But it was still a tent at that time. And so David says to Nathan, what about a house for God? Now you have to understand, that's duality again. House of sons, house as a building. So Nathan gets the word from God, oh, you want to build me a house, huh? Okay. I don't need a house to live in. What kind of house do I need to live in? The heavens can't contain me. Yeah, and then God gives him what ends up occupying like 50% of the Old Testament on instructions how to build that temple. And he also awards David a house of sons, which will eventuate in David's greater son, namely the Messiah. So now you know that the entire promise of time depends on David. Okay, but David isn't going to live, that long. Not only that, but this temple is a promise to David. Got to get that. The temple is a promise to David. Go look it up yourself in 2 Samuel 7. It is not a promise to Israel. Israel rejected God as king. Israel rejected her inheritance. But David did not. So God appointed David king, grafts Israel into and through David, and therefore through David the temple, and therefore 1 Kings 9 reads as it does. So long as the temple is standing, the contract with Israel is standing. The minute that temple goes down, the contract goes down. Now, it's not a permanent breach of contract, but it is a breach. And that means there's a breach in time. Because all time goes through David, because Israel rejected God as king in 1050 BC. Now, actually, it's this whole issue of Israel rejecting God as king which caused me to finally put the pieces together on this how God constructs time thing. Because I was looking at 1077 BC, 1077 AD, which I just found out 2 weeks ago Paul is also talking about. And when I get to the Paul passage again, I'll show you. Okay, and I thought, gee, that's a mirror of something that happened in Israel's past. Is that a mirror of 1077 BC? And what happened then? Well, it was really 1050. And that's what everything you see in front of you came out of that. I thought I had made a typographical error. And then I saw the mirror between 1077 when I thought Israel's history was supposed to end. And again, Paul actually uses that in his meter, which I didn't know till 2 weeks ago. But it turned out it was 1050, not 1077. That's what sent me back to Daniel 9 and made me realize this balance sheet thing that God's been doing. And that was back in 2004 when this all hit me. And it hit. So if you feel like, oh, Brian, I'm so smart and I don't understand this and my eyes are glazing over. Okay, well, my eyes have glazed over for the last 10 years. Okay, and especially the last 6. And I do numbers for a living. So just keep plugging, keep using 1 John 1:9 and you'll get this. This was when history should have ended, right here. 3056. 10 years after Abram's personal 1000 ended. But still under Moses. Okay, the time grant. But God raised up David because Moses had won the time grant initially. God honors his promise. Moses wanted it transferred to Israel, okay, but Moses still won it. So you'll notice, because Moses is a leader of Israel, the fact that Israel rejects is still okay if the leader does not reject. Now, Israel rejected, but the leader did not, and his time grant continues. So now God raises up another leader. In this case, a king, who in 2 Samuel 7 says, hey, I want my Lord to have a house. Yeah, okay. You can't contain me in a house. So I'll give you like half the Old Testament's going to be dedicated to how you make the house. And by the way, I'm going to give you a house of sons, resulting in Messiah. Okay? So all the time grants go through David from here on out. You got that? And notice the pivotal time that it occurs that David is crowned. He is crowned during the voting window for the world. This is the unbeliever voting window between 3100 and 3150 from Adam. David is crowned king. He retires in 970, okay, which is also during the voting window. David lives to be 77, not 70, okay? If you just read 1 Kings 1 through 1 Kings 6:1, you'll see that. 1 Kings 2, verse 39 or so, somewhere in there, Shimei is executed in the 3rd year after David dies. The 4th year after David dies, the temple begins construction, and that's why it's called the 4th year of Solomon, because you're always dating in the Bible from a thing. In that case, it was from David's death, because that's how the chronicler of 1 Kings was writing it. The 1st year after David dies, the 2nd year after David dies. He doesn't have to say that it's after David dies because he already killed David off in 1 Kings 2. So now it's 1st year after, 2nd year after, 3rd year after, 4th year after. See, if you just do a little bit of reading, which the scholars didn't do. Now, I mean, I'm not trying to debunk scholars exactly, but, you know, they can be extremely stubborn and prejudiced. And they just look at what other people have said, and they don't bother to revisit the Bible. This is a stain on them. They should have revisited the Bible. David was 77 when he dies, but they used Josephus instead. Okay? Instead of looking at the Bible. And if you look at the Bible in 1 Kings chapter 1 to 1 Kings 6:1, you'll notice David was 77 when he dies. And that's why Isaiah uses 77 syllables. Because Isaiah is going to pick up where Moses left off. Moses leaves off right here. 350 syllables from 1440. That's 1050. That's when Israel's going to reject God. That's the warning of in the chronology, the consecutive chronology of the 350 syllables in Psalm 90. Okay, but we're looking at the panoramic, the 70-70-70 accounting, which takes us all the way down to the other time when Israel rejected God. When her temple's going to go out, 120 years after that, pregnant number, is the absolute voting window for believers. If there's no temple, there's no vote. There's no time. So this is what Moses is tracking to. Now, how much did Moses actually know? I'm not sure. But Isaiah knows. And that's why Isaiah started predicting the temple was going to fall in Isaiah 40, chapter 40 onward. He starts telling you chapter and verse. He starts telling you blow by blow how the temple's going to go down. Meanwhile, back here, after the period of Judges, after Samuel, after Saul, comes David 10 years later, born, crowned when he's 30, crowned head of all Israel 7 years later, because there's a 7-year civil war between year and year, just in time for the unbeliever voting window, so people can vote with their feet to become a Jew. That's how you if you wanted God, you became a Jew. And they could vote with their feet and go to Israel, and Israel's in the center of the earth, so it was easier to get there. People traveled a lot in the old days. They basically lived on their feet. Okay? And they enjoyed it too. So here you go, 3100 to 3150. It was safer to travel on your feet, actually, than to stay in one place. So they could vote with their feet and come to Israel, which was the nexus of 3 continents. Still is. Okay? So now you know the import of David being crowned. So now we're going to go through what happened next. Again, David, 2 Samuel 7, gets the promise to have two kinds of houses. A temple building, and then the temple depicts David's greater son, Messiah. The temple was like a Bible in architecture. Okay, it depicted every single doctrine that there was, and every single doctrine there would be. And the priests were going to be in charge of telling the time. And David, in his retirement between 970 and 963 when he dies, designs the 24 priestly courses in 1 Chronicles 24. And every single course for every single week of the year is prophetic about what would happen that week. Okay? Including the week that Messiah would be born, which I cover in pastplot.htm, which you should have seen by now. So now, 950 BC, the same year that Moses' personal 490 runs out, there's a 490 to the temple. Underneath it, because due to it, is David's own 490s that are benchmarked here, benchmarked here, benchmarked here. Okay, maybe benchmarked here, but I didn't track them. Okay, so now we're going to look at that, because that's how we get to Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17. So, temple is constructed, dedicated in 1 Etanim. That's what we call Rosh Hashanah today. Okay, 950 BC, and that's where the 1 Kings 9 contract comes in. The temple has, due to David, its own contract. Temple down, then Israel down. Okay, temple up, Israel up. That's the point. That's in 1 Kings 9. You can go read it. Alright, that's what Solomon prayed on 1 Etanim when he dedicates the temple. Alright, and the temple meant Messiah was coming. The temple depicted everything about time, about the Bible. Every doctrine was in architecture. Okay, it wasn't the biggest temple ever built. It was the most meaningful one, however. And all the temple service David himself designed at God's direction. So this was the wonder of the world. People came all over the world to see it. Now, the problem was that since this is a 490, the temple gets its own 490, and that's why Daniel 9 reads as it does. Now look at this. Uh-oh. Okay, 950 minus 490. Hello, what did I do wrong? 950 minus 490. 460 BC, the temple had a promise of time lasting until 460 BC. But again, it was subject to the 1 Kings 9 contract. Okay? And if she didn't stay, then the contract would end. And it did in 586 BC, which we'll pick up in the next segment.